evening, everyone. Good evening. Can you hear me? I'm Alice Langtree, and I want to thank you all very much for taking the time to be here tonight. Clearly, you care about education and how things go in our schools. And as we know, education is something the state has plenty to say about because of the constitutional requirement, because a good chunk of the state budget is devoted to it. I want to take a moment to thank Upper St. Clair School District for the use of this facility tonight, and a very special thank you to my legislative assistant, Susan Hughes, who has also worked very hard to pull this together. Please note this evening's printed agenda, and we're going to make every effort to stick to it and to stick to the subject. We're here this evening to try to shed some light on a new system of education requirements in Pennsylvania called outcomes-based education, which will affect every student, our teachers, parents, school boards, administrators, indeed, our entire community. These education requirements are promulgated by regulation by the State Board of Education. The State Board has the power and the duty to review and adopt regulations that govern education policies and principles, and to establish standards governing education programs in this Commonwealth. Outcomes education is complex and certainly not devoid of controversy. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, someone, Pennsylvania is the first state to propose this on a statewide basis. I'm aware that outcomes is not widely understood, although its implementation is imminent. I thought it important to offer this education forum for the 40th Legislative District, which I represent in the Pennsylvania House, and that 40th District consisting of Bethel Park, Scott Township, and Upper St. Clair. Together, hopefully, we can better understand and affect the forthcoming changes that will impact our local schools. In that regard, on the panel this evening are several local educators who have graciously consented to give another evening of their time to discuss outcomes-based education, a system that our local schools are compelled to implement, and within certain time frames. Representing Upper St. Clair, way over on the far left, you're right, Dr. Furman, the principal of Boyce School. Next to him, Dinah Fulmer, member of the Board of Directors, Upper St. Clair School District. Dr. Swatala, Director of Secondary Education, will be along at any moment, I'm quite sure. And of course, we all know Jim Flaherty, President of the School Board of Directors in Bethel Park. I regret that Chartiers Valley School District in Scott was unable to participate on the panel this evening, especially since Char Valley is among the first third of the 501 school districts that will start implementing outcomes education. However, I'm certain our local educators will fill us in on what to expect and when. Also on the panel, I'm pleased that Greg White has come from Harrisburg to help us out. Greg is Executive Director for the Minority Caucus, that's me, of the Education Committee of the Pennsylvania House. As such, he is familiar with all aspects of educational law, policy, regulations of the State Board of Education, the State Department of Education, the Education Committee of the Pennsylvania House, and probably the Pennsylvania Senate. A graduate of Kent State, the University of Pittsburgh, a journalism master's from Temple, Greg is a family man who enjoys golf, and military history, and best of all, is fully knowledgeable about outcomes education. Very shortly, he'll give us a full explanation of outcomes, followed by local educators to comment as they wish. For a quick overview, as I understand it, and I'm still learning, outcomes-based education, in essence, shifts away from prescriptive curriculum requirements based on hours spent in the classroom and credits earned to a system in which students must demonstrate competency in 52 measurable outcomes in order to advance and to graduate. Local school districts are free to add their own outcomes. Those 52 state outcomes are based on and directly align with 15 goals of quality education. 5 of the goals are Common Core goals, on which students will not be assessed. 10 are instructional goals, on which the students will be assessed. Other major elements, and may I call it outcomes for short, other major elements of outcomes include subjects to be taught at each level. High school graduation requirements are changed. New requirements for vocational technical education. All local schools will be assessed by the state and evaluated for effectiveness, and the results will be published. A report card on our schools, if you will. Local schools will have the flexibility to assess student achievement of the 52 outcomes in various ways. Now list some. Of course, successful completion of the outcomes. That's required. Satisfactory completion of courses will contribute to that success. Students will be able to demonstrate achievement through standardized tests, diagnostic assessments, independent study, community service, summer school or summer study, by work experience, travel, educational travel, by correspondence courses or higher education courses. Quite a few options there. Broadly, other elements of outcomes-based are traditional grade structures, and the traditional grading systems need not be retained. They may be. It's up to the local schools. Community involvement is required along with school personnel and school boards in developing what is called a strategic plan. That is, a plan to implement the outcomes-based system. Educators, parents, students, business and community representatives shall participate in developing the strategic plan, and that plan will show how outcomes education is to be implemented locally. Local schools will have a great deal of flexibility. However, the state will have the right to approve or disapprove those strategic plans. There are other elements in outcomes-based which Greg White may want to bring to our attention when he comes up to speak. What is the status of the state regulations on outcomes? As of this date, all the regulations are finally approved, except for the 52 outcomes on which final approval is planned for this September. So it's important for all of us to thoroughly review those outcomes and to make our views known before September. If you take the paper clip off the regulations, you'll see that there are 4 sections. The first one is Chapter 3, called School Profiles. The first section consists of 2 sheets, and what this section does is, I won't go into it too much, but I did want to point out on page 2, Under definitions, you'll see a term PSSA. If you got it, we're on page 2 of chapter 3. That's the first 2 sheets in the packet. Okay? If you'll turn to page 2 of chapter 3, I don't know, a little more than halfway down the page, under definitions, you'll see the term PSSA. That stands for the Pennsylvania System of School Assessments. And that is the system by which local schools will be evaluated for effectiveness by the state and the results published. I bring that up because you're going to be hearing that acronym a great deal, PSSA. Moving on to the next section of the packet, which, as you'll see, is Chapter 5, called Curriculum. This section covers state policy and requirements for outcomes-based education. This section consists of 27 pages. If you'll turn to page 3 of Chapter 5, once again, halfway down, we come to the section on definitions. If you look under that section, you'll see a definition for curriculum. You'll note that the definition requires the achievement by all students of specific knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors. If you'll keep going down to the last paragraph on page 3, you'll see the term instruction. This requires instruction to students to achieve the goals of quality education under sections 5201 and the learning outcomes under 5202. Now, if you'll kindly turn to page 6, near the top you'll see section 5201. Okay, that's page 6 of chapter 5. Near the top of the page, section 5201, Goals of Quality Education. Under if you'll see C, 5201 ABC, under C are listed the 5 common core goals that students will have the opportunity to develop, namely, self-worth is the first one, learning independently and collaboratively, adaptability to change, ethical judgment, and excuse me, I forgot number 2, information and thinking skills. And as I said earlier, due to recent changes in the regulations, these 5 goals will not be assessed by the state. Continuing on to the bottom of that page, you'll see subsection D. See, I'm trying to follow along with my notes here. You'll see listed communications number 1, and then continuing on page 7, from 2 to 10. These are the additional 10 instructional goals. They start with communications, go through math, science, technology, environment, citizenship, and on down through number 10, personal and family community living. For those of you who have read these 10 instructional goals on which students will be assessed, it's important to know that under instructional goal 6, appreciating and understanding others, the word lifestyles has been removed by the state board. Additionally, under goal 10, personal, family, and community living, the word successfully has been removed by the state board. Every word in these goals is extremely important. The 52 outcomes are aligned and based on these 10 goals, and as I keep saying, students will be assessed on them. You'll note that throughout the 10 instructional goals, the terms attitudes and behaviors, even the term habits, appear throughout the goals. This has engendered a great deal of concern, the questions usually being, well, whose attitudes, whose behaviors? How are educators to be placed in a position to fairly measure these affective areas? It's a tough order. Okay, moving to the bottom of page 7, you'll see listed, same section, we're still in the same section, student learning outcomes. Those are the 52 outcomes that everyone's talking about, and they are listed. You go to the last 3 pages of this packet, the outcomes are listed separately. I think you probably all have them. Section 202, student learning outcomes. Have we all found them? Yeah, I know it's hard to follow all this. It's the last 3 pages in this packet, or last 3 sheets, excuse me, not pages. Okay? And on the top, it says Chapter 5, Curriculum, Section 202, Student Learning Outcomes. Those are the 52 outcomes that we have been talking about that have engendered so much concern. Those are the 52 outcomes also that have not yet been finally approved by the State Board of Education. You'll want to read them very carefully once again, and it's important also to remember that local schools can add their own outcomes in addition to these outcomes. When you have an opportunity to read them, I think some of you will agree that some of those outcomes are pretty good. Some of them are not bad at all. Some have said that other outcomes are fuzzy, quote unquote, vague, too inclusive, not inclusive enough, or just plain wrong. For example, if you want to turn to page 4, on the top you'll see the term citizenship. The first outcome on that page, all students explore themes, patterns, and alternative interpretations of history. Well, that's a rather interesting terminology. I don't see the requirement in the outcomes, for example, for the ability to spell, but the local schools will probably want to add that type of thing onto their outcomes. One assumes that they will do that in their strategic plan. But back to the main portion of Chapter 5, this also covers such other areas as the strategic plan that we've talked about that we'll implement locally, write and implement locally, the employment of sufficient professional employees, teachers, to handle this new outcomes education. You'll note also in Section 5 a policy on discrimination, curriculum requirements by level, not by grade, by level, parental rights. It also deals with special ed, HIV/AIDS education, how the local schools will assess students, and the new graduation requirements, which is one thing I hope Greg will fill us in on the details of the new education requirements. On to Chapter 6, the final section in your packet. We're not going to go fishing for it, but it's also important. It deals with vocational technical education, and it establishes apprenticeship programs. I like that one. And other technical programs, and also establishes standards. Now, since these regulations were printed, several changes have been made, and I mentioned 2 of them. There have been others. There is now a prohibition on student identification on state and school assessments. Parents have the right to have their children excused from instruction which conflicts with their religious beliefs and parents have the right to have their children excused from state assessments. Remember, that's what the state will do to measure the local schools. The 5 Common Core goals will not be used for state assessment. I already said that. The word lifestyles and successful have been removed. I mentioned that. Agriculture and agricultural sciences have been added to science courses, and provisions for experimental programs have been removed. After you've had a chance to study, review, think about these outcomes, I would very much appreciate receiving from you, in writing, if possible, your specific proposals for changes in the wording, deletions, additions, or even new outcomes, if you think. And I would also like to know why, and please feel free to call me anytime to discuss this with me. On those 51 outcomes, I will certainly get that information back to Harrisburg. And if you don't want to go through me, feel free to directly contact the State Board of Education, 333 Market Street, Harrisburg. Let's see, what is it, 17120? Is that the zip, Greg? Yes, and so that covers an overview for the moment. At this point, I think you'd probably be interested in hearing from Greg White, and if I've covered areas that he covers, well, I'm sorry for the repetition, but maybe it'll help. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Langtree. My purpose tonight is to try and put this in a framework perspective so that you can understand what has happened, a little bit of history about how this has evolved, fill in a little bit more of the details if I can, and then when we get to the question and answer session, to try and serve as a resource for you to ask questions and see if I can at least provide some more detailed answers for things that may not have been covered by any of the speakers tonight. I'm going to try and go rather rapidly through a number of things, talking about the proposal itself, the potential fiscal implications of the proposal, and also just to talk about a little bit of its impact on school districts, but I will let the representatives from the 2 school districts here try and talk about a little bit more detail how it would impact on their individual districts. First, a little bit of history and framework. In 1983-84, in response to a report known as The Nation at Risk, almost every state in the country changed their curriculum requirements. They added the traditional academic course requirements, particularly graduation requirements at the high school level. They added more years of English, more units of credits in sciences, social sciences, mathematics. Upon reflection, at least from the State Board of Education's perspective, and probably true in most states, that really has not improved the quality of public education and levels of student achievement. One of the things we have particularly found out, and when adding additional units of credits in both mathematics and science, we found out that the instruction is not necessarily progressive in many school districts. Students may take 3 different years of mathematics, but the skill levels do not increase from the freshman, sophomore, and junior years measurably, and they are basically taking a lot of repetition over 3 years. As a result, the State Board of Education, which reviews its regulations every 4 years, decided that they were going to take a completely different look at our curriculum requirements, moving from the time block, subject-specific Carnegie unit that you and I all went through in American history, biology, chemistry, physics, whatever, different levels of English, to an approach which enables school districts to move away from those specific units of credit and says to school districts, you no longer have to teach these units in a specific time block, which is known as 120 clock hours. That's your 40, 45, 50-minute period, depending upon how the school district has organized its instructional day. The purpose of this is twofold. They hope to provide greater flexibility to school districts to deliver their instructional program, and they hope to do some cross-disciplinary teaching kinds of things and to set higher standards for students. Outcomes-based education is not new. It has been tried by school districts around the country for a number of years. There are other states that are implementing parts of this. We are clearly the national leader at this point. The genesis for us moving in this direction, whether you agree with it or not, really came out of the state of Kentucky. In a court case, their state Supreme Court threw out their entire education system from top to bottom. It wiped out school districts, it wiped out superintendents, it wiped out the entire tax structure, it wiped out everything. They literally redesigned their education system, and they are redesigning it around outcome-based education. We are also getting comments from the business community, particularly a report that came out from the U.S. Department of Labor, known as the Secretary's Commission on Achieving Necessary Skills for Students, in which the business community identified the kinds of things they want students to be able to do. The ability to identify, organize, plan, and allocate resources, ability to work with others, ability to acquire and use information, understand complex interrelationships, work with a variety of technologies, work with other people. They wanted students to get involved with learning social skills, attitudes about how to work with other people, and things like promptness, accepting responsibility, things of that nature. This document, whether you accept it or not, and I'm not going to judge it, reflects that kind of thinking. Our State Chamber of Business and Industry and our Pennsylvania Business Roundtable, which is a coalition of our major state corporations, has very strongly endorsed this document. Now, the State Board of Education has been working on this document for a period of about 3 years. That'll come as a surprise to most of you because most of the people in the general public only found out about this within at least, I would say, about the last 6 months. But they have been meeting with a number of people all across the state, predominantly educators, to begin to develop this document. As Representative Langtree said, the regulations which set up the framework for this proposal have been adopted by the State Board of Education. They have been approved under the regulatory review process by both the House and Senate Education Committees, and in that respect by both the House of Representatives and the Senate. If there were to be any changes to that document, it would now either have to go through a complete regulatory rewrite or the legislature would have to change it by statute. Let me go into a couple of the specifics of the proposal now. As Representative Langtree mentioned, the first step on this is something called strategic planning. Districts are required to submit every 6 years a plan to the Department of Education with a midterm update every 3 years. This plan will have to be developed in conjunction with educators and community representatives. Teachers, administrators, the boards will all select people to sit on this. The business community has to be involved in it. Community representatives have to be involved in it. It is this plan which will develop how the school district implements outcome-based education and how far it wants to go with outcome-based education. The plan will be submitted to the Department of Education. The department will have a team to review it, and they will approve or disapprove it. If they disapprove it, the district will go back to and negotiate with the department on changes that the department believes are necessary. The next component is the Pennsylvania State School Assessment System, the PSSA. This will be a testing system that is replacing what you used to know as the TELS test. TELS test was a minimum competency test in math and reading, which was a diagnostic thing. We tried to identify students who weren't up to grade level and then provide remedial assistance to those students. This test will not be a student identifiable test. I will admit to you there were problems in the administration and implementation of the test this year. but with the changes that Representative Langtree outlined, future tests will not have student identifiable information. The test will be given initially, and they were given this spring for school districts that will be in the first stage of strategic planning, approximately 1/3 of the districts this year, in reading, in mathematics, and a writing assessment. They were in grades 5, 8, 11. The writing assessment is in grades 6 and 9. All students are not tested. This program works something like, I guess you would call it the public opinion polls that Gallup and Harris do. It is a sampling system. So all students are not tested, therefore identifiable information on individual students should not be needed. Now, doing that process allows the district to spend less time testing. It takes up less time for the and for students, and it makes it easier to administer the test. It also makes it, frankly, cheaper for the state to administer the test. The purpose behind the test is to give us a report card on how school buildings are doing. That's part of the school profile, which Representative Langtree mentioned. It is not to identify how individual students are doing. This curriculum that you will be developing under outcomes-based education is based on the goals of quality education. They are self-worth, information and thinking skills, learning independently and collaboratively, adaptability to change, and ethical judgment. A great deal of concern has been expressed about how you assess students on these particular goals, whose ethical values are involved, how you measure adaptability to change, how you measure self-worth, and what kinds of specific objectives would have to be developed around them. As a result of the comments that were received, the House and Senate Education Committee, particularly the House Committee, requested that the State Board of Education not attempt to do learning outcomes for these particular goals and not attempt to measure them. They are going to be a part of the curriculum in the sense that districts will weave part of their instructional and program around them. Let me say this, these are not new. They have been a part of state instructions to school districts for their curriculum for the better part of 20 years. Students were never directly assessed on those particular goals, but they have been part of the goals of quality education that this state has had since the early 1970s. The other goals are the communications, mathematics, science and technology. Well, you have the list. Again, a number of concerns were raised about these goals not being purely academic and being also attitudinal in nature. Some concerns came up. The legislature again asked the State Board of Education, the Secretary of Education, and the board agreed to take out the two words that Representative Langtree mentioned, the question about lifestyles and the question about successful on the goals of personal, family, and community living. If you go back and look at the learning outcome statements, you will see some of these words reappearing in those learning outcomes. That document was last revised in March. It does not reflect the changes that were made by the State Board of Education at its May meeting. Those particular learning outcomes, at least in my opinion and many others, is they will have to be revised to reflect those particular changes. Okay. The learning outcomes. We are in the process of reviewing the learning outcomes right now. The State Board of Education yesterday completed its last public hearing. There were 3 public hearings. The House Education Committee is holding 5 hearings on this particular document. We have one tomorrow at the Wilkins Township Elementary School over near Monroeville. The board has set an objective of September as the date which they would like to finally adopt them. A number of concerns have been expressed about them. These will be the specific learning objectives that school districts are to focus on from a state perspective. The district has the ability and option to add as many as they wish. They are not real specific. The reason for that is the question is whether the state should do the difference between macro and micro planning. The people who have developed these for the state believe that the state should not be any more specific than that, otherwise they will interfere with the curriculum decisions made by the school district. The rationale behind that is, one, it's Pennsylvania tradition. We have a very strong tradition of local control in this state. You may not believe that, but if you would look at the curriculum that the state of Texas has selected for its particular school districts, the state of California, they pick the textbooks that school districts and students will use. The curriculum for the state of California, or South Carolina, breaks down the school day into these minute time blocks and tells school districts and teachers how they are to teach and what they are to teach. The philosophy behind that is generally not being accepted anymore, and the purpose behind this, as I said, was to give school districts additional flexibility. Graduation requirements. Let me add one other thing on the learning outcomes. There is a question that has come up about the attitudinal nature of these to some extent because they reflect the goals, and whether some of these things are still accessible, also whether they're clear enough. And teachers in particular have asked whether it might not be a good idea to establish benchmarks. Certain time periods during the schooling of a child as to when you have to define what a specific outcome that child should achieve and whether that child then can move to the next one. It doesn't necessarily have to be at every grade level, from second to third, from sixth to seventh. It could be at the end of the primary grades, at the end of the intermediate grades, and then moving into high school. Those kinds of questions have to be debated, will be determined over the next several months, and how much flexibility districts have will in part be determined by what decision is made on that. Graduation requirements, as Representative Langtree mentioned, have been changed. We have moved away from students taking specific units, those time blocks I mentioned, 4 units in English, 3 in math, 3 in science, 3 in social studies, 2 in arts and humanities, 1 unit in health and phys ed, and 5 electives. Students will be measured against those learning objectives, and that will determine whether or not they graduate. The district will make that determination, and they will have to be able to document to the state that students have achieved these objectives. In addition, students will be measured on a final project through a portfolio assessment of their individual work over a period of time. The districts will have flexibility as to how they wish to measure that. There's one other change, and this really needs a lot of work. We will require that students will eventually be able to converse in a second language. The implementation of this is quite far down the road. It will come into effect when a student enters the school district after its strategic plan is submitted to the department. Let me talk about the implementation of this for school districts. As we have discussed earlier, 1/3 of the districts will be starting this fall. They will go into the strategic planning process. They will develop their strategic plan through the next school year, 92-93. In the fall of 1993, they will submit the plan to the Department of Education. It will go through that disapproval process by the committee. It will not just be PDE bureaucrats who make that determination. There will be other educators who sit on that committee. After it has been approved, the district will continue its implementation of it. The requirements for student instruction will then take effect in the following year, which would be the 94 school year. Fiscal implications of the proposal. The fiscal data that the Board of Education is required to prepare for the legislature and for the general public does not give a specific cost for implementation of this proposal. There are several key components which will cost school districts money. Moving to an outcomes-based education system is something that most teachers are not very familiar with. The proposal will require significant staff retraining at the school district level. The department will provide some technical assistance. Districts presently do some of this training through in-service programming. A number of your students, children, have days off of school when teachers are in service. The State Board and the department believe those days can be used to do some of this staff training. There will also be cost for the portfolio assessments. This takes more time for teachers. The department has made an assumption that existing staff can handle this. We'll see. To offset the training costs and the added staff time and the cost of paying for that added staff time, the department, State Board, and the Pennsylvania School Boards Association has told us that they believe that the added flexibility that is provided in these regulations will enable them to restructure the program to offset either a significant or possibly all of these costs. We have had people who are involved in training tell us that the program will not reduce costs. We have statewide associations telling us that it can. Secondly, the question about the foreign language requirement. The word is students will be able to converse in another language. I don't know what that means. School districts don't know what that means. The teachers will not know what that means. And depending upon how that is interpreted, could have a significant impact on what a district has to do with its foreign language requirement and how it provides foreign language instruction to its students. There's clearly one area that has to be cleared up. It is frankly based on the notion of the European model, where almost all students do take a foreign language. By the year 2005, they want all of their students to be conversant or able to speak a foreign language, 3 different foreign languages. I think Representative Langtry's gone through most of the significant changes. Those changes were made as a result of significant public input, pressure to the legislature. The legislature, I think, responded and asked the board and the department, rather we insisted really, that those changes be made, and they were. I'm sure they don't address all the concerns that some people have. That is where we are in the process. I think at this point we would turn it over to school districts and let them try and explain how it would impact on their operations.
I would like now to have Mr. Flaherty from the Beth Park School District address us with a few words.
Alice really doesn't know how many few words I have to say about it tonight. One of the things is Bill Spatala is not here. Bill has our slides, our plan, and our information. But let me just talk a little bit about the outcome-based education and some of the things that we followed and maybe some of the concerns we have and some of the things we're looking at as far as the school district. As Alice said, right now, from all appearances, I'd say it's one of those things that are 99.9% sure that this is what we have. So I think the best way to say the attitude of the Bethel Park School District, or at least my attitude, and it's very tough to speak for 9 individuals, as people know, is that the process right now has to be one of trying to make the most out of something that we all have very serious concerns about. I think probably one of the few good things that I can say that's come out of this is that we have slowed down the process a little bit from what I originally have perceived the process to be, to at least give an opportunity for us to grow into some of these requirements and very critical areas and very critical decisions that we have to face over the next year to 2 years. One of the things is Bethel Park is not one of the school districts in the first phase of the process. We do have a little time to sit back and look and watch and kind of get a feeling for other school districts. I can say that there certainly is a concern on the board and certainly a concern within the administration of some of the things that we have to face during this period and process. We know that it's going to require a great deal of cooperation from a lot of people in the community. We're talking about parents, administrators, teachers, board members, business leaders. Everyone needs to be involved and own part of this process, or the process will fail. And when the process fails, our education that we're giving to the children fails. We all have concerns, and we've talked about them tonight. There's certainly, and a lot of people out there have known me, I am not a proponent of measuring attitudes. I don't know how a classroom teacher measures attitudes. And these are the types of things that we're going to be facing if the process proceeds the way it's proceeding right now. Another concern I have is the transition phase from one process to the other, not from only a teacher perspective or a board perspective, but an administrative perspective. We also have a student perspective. It's tough enough teaching children in these days when they really understand what's going on, and a lot of these children, even if they're in the first and second grade, they have some history, older brothers and sisters that help them through that process. The first couple years of this process is going to be really rough. I know it's easy coming into a classroom when a teacher says that your grade's going to be based on your test scores and it's going to be based on a final grade, but a lot of those things aren't in place right now, and there's going to be a certain uneasiness or a certain awareness that we have to have as educators and as parents to make sure that that process also happens in a transitional manner, that the students understand the process. They are the ones that have the biggest stake and the biggest reason for success. We also need to carefully measure and provide the criteria that students are going to be measured on, and we have to make sure that that our measurement of the progress toward the attainment of outcomes is consistent, and that it's logical, and that that's easily followed. And that's another area of concern. And I think one of the things that we talked about lastly is the fiscal implications. We're all facing budget concerns as it is. We all know that significant training will be required, and this training has got to be fairly intense, fairly rapid. We're going to have to really understand some of our staff needs over the next couple of years. Some teachers, some administrators are going to need much more training, much more compassion, and a lot of other things as we move through this process. And we need to understand that as community leaders and as residents of communities. One thing we know about the state and things they've done is that in my years on the board, my years dealing with education, and I think even since growing up, one thing we know is they seem to never allocate enough money for these types of processes. So that we can only hope that there will be help there, and that these things will be looked at. I can say right now, the board's been following the process. We have not been presented or have not agreed on a definitive plan through the process, but it's pretty clearly stated in the regulations that the strategic planning process needs to begin, and as I said before, is probably the most important process that we'll be going through in the short term. And that's one of the things that we were looking at right now, and one of the things that Bill was spoken to in a little bit more detail. I really don't have anything more at this time, but I thank you people for attending and showing your concern and interest in the process.
Thank you very much. And now for 10 minutes, we'll turn it over to Dr. Furman and Mrs. Fulmer, and then we'll get on to the question and answer portion.
No, I never pass. He said that we would split this up. Bob will talk about the nitty-gritty, and I'll talk about the philosophy. I first heard about this 2 years ago when Dr. Longo came to Shasta to talk about OBE. And at the time, I thought it was the greatest thing since Scotch tape. This meant that a kid, this is what it meant to me, a kid would go over and over and over and over his times tables until he knew them. Then he would move on to something else. If a kid could show at age 5 that he could do in his head 18 times 22, he didn't have to do it any more, so that perhaps he could be 10 and taking calculus. Well, then we get all this stuff, and it turns out I was wrong. However, what OBE, as we call it, seems to push is that every student can learn. Some learn quickly, some learn much more slowly, and that success breeds success, and that a child has to learn A before he can go to B. One thing builds on another. And also it has been endorsed by, of all people, Chester Finn, who was undersecretary to Bennett. Now, and you could hardly find a more conservative educator in this whole world. So I still have hopes for OBE. I do not have hopes that it's going to come cheaply. Nothing from the state comes cheaply. And the state, of course, after having told us, now what can you do to cut expenses, is loading something else on it which will raise them. However, I think that in the long term, if we are willing to change the way we think, and this is what it takes, as our superintendent tells us all the time, it's a new paradigm. And if we are willing to change the way we think, I think we can make it work. But I don't know about September '93.
I'm supposed to give you the nitty-gritty. To be quite candid about it, I'm not sure if I'm prepared to do that. But I would like to share with you some of my perspectives on outcome-based education. I have to be right up front with you. I'm really speaking from a personal perspective more than the school district's perspective, because we are fortunate enough also to have some think time We're like Bethel Park, we have like 2 years before we start our strategic plan and start to really implement the concept of outcomes-based education. So a lot of this is my personal interpretation of what outcomes-based education means and what the state, I think, is trying to do. And I don't have any prepared remarks, I'm just going to run on here. When you get, you feel my 10 minutes is up or 5 minutes, you just sort of jump up and I'll sit down. Representative Langtree, okay?
4 to go.
4 to go, okay, very quickly. I think in spirit, I think it's okay. I'm really not worried too much about the intent and the spirit behind this initiative. Because I think what they're saying, the way I read it, is that we want children to demonstrate competence in all aspects of their instruction before moving on to the next step, rather than being time-driven, which means we give students a certain window of opportunity to learn a certain concept. For example, learn algebra in 8th grade. Maybe that's what we say. So all the children coming through the system in 8th grade, this would be their window of opportunity to learn algebra. However, the students that follow through that sequence at the time that we predict it, they're easy to get through. It's the ones that go ahead of that time frame and get there before their normal window of opportunity. They create problems, and the kids that come slower than their normal window of opportunity create problems. So I think the state's saying that let's just demonstrate competence regardless of when they're ready to do it. I hope that's what they're saying. I hope that's what they're saying. And outcomes-based education, the way one of the gurus, Dr. Spady from out on the West Coast, he's sort of the guru of outcomes-based education, at least one of them. He looks at it quite differently, because my background is in curriculum, and I was sort of surprised when I heard him describe it. How he describes it is this: you think of an observable, measurable, identifiable exit behavior that you want your children from your school district, Bethel Park, Char Valley, all the school districts in our Commonwealth, what do you want them to be able to do? And then once you know that behavior, and he uses the analogy of landing an airplane, if your behavior that you want to teach students to be able to do, be to land an airplane, then you back up from that and you decide what learnings, what knowledge, what skills, what attitudes, what all the things you have to go into eventually developing that ability to be able to land the airplane. So I'll try to share what I'm trying to think. This is how I'm interpreting it. This isn't a good one. But let's just see. I don't think we can turn that off. At the end of 12th grade, if we decided in Upper St. Clair that our children would be able to respond in a multi-paragraph composition to a prompt that requires the presentation, analysis, and synthesis and details, if they'd be able to do something like that, then we should say, okay, let's back up now. We have to have some kind of an evaluation criteria, some kind of an assessment battery that we can see. We can actually see the students do something that shows their knowledge, their competence, and their attitude. This is what they're saying, I think. Then we would say, we can measure that at the end of 12th grade. Then we have to back up and say, well, at the end of 8th grade, here's a step. They should be at this point. They should be at this point, which is a little more simplistic, but which relates to that long-term exit outcome at the end of 12th grade. And if you back up another step, there should be another observable, measurable behavior that we would assess at the end, say, of 4th grade. Now they're saying also, at least the experts, the gurus that I'm reading about, they're saying that these behaviors, these exit behaviors, should have 3 dimensions. Whatever we have the children do to prove to us that they're competent, they should be able to show the knowledge, their competence or skill level, and what they're referring to as orientations, and that's attitude, their work ethic, their motivation to achieve. So if this is all true, here's what this means to us, for St. Clair and Bethel and all the school districts. Then, if that's true, we have to take, and if we're dictated or mandated to teach those 52 behaviors, outcomes, then we have to train our teachers to be able to decide upon, identify very sophisticated, three-dimensional exit behaviors, complex tasks that they can actually see the kids do. We have to teach our teachers to be able to identify and develop those kinds of exit behaviors. And then we have to develop a system to assess that, to make sure that Johnny Jones knows it and Susie Jones doesn't yet, which is a major undertaking. But in spirit and in intent, I think it makes sense. Logistically, it might be kind of difficult to pull off, at least on a short time frame. So that's how I'm interpreting it, that we have to take those 52, if they're given to us, and decide upon. But in spirit and in intent, I think it makes sense. Logistically, it might be kind of difficult to pull off, at least on a short time frame. So that's how I'm interpreting it, that we have to take those 52, if they're given to us, and decide upon how we're going to get these sophisticated behaviors that we can see demonstrated so we know the kids got it. That's how we're interpreting it. We have time to study it. One thing we are going to do as a school district, because of our curriculum change process, we have a process that we follow each year. We look at the whole curriculum in the district, K to 12, every year. We're going to actually pick one curricular area. For example, language arts, and we think it's going to be at the middle school level, because we're given a charge by our board to look at that particular curricular areas in more detail for next year. We're going to develop that unit of instruction, always trying to make it a prototype of the way we're interpreting outcome-based education. And if we can do that next year, over this summer and next year, we'll be able to field test this unit of instruction and use it as a model that we can now then use to carry it throughout the district. We are planning an in-service in our school district here on the 18th of June for all of our administrators and all of our curriculum leaders, because we had a team, 3 of our administrators, myself and 2 others. We were trained for 2 days by Dr. Spady. We're going to have another week in Harrisburg in July. But in June, we're going to at least bring our curriculum leaders up to the point of knowledge that we have at this point. And because they go out there and develop our curriculum, we feel that this knowledge will impact upon all the curriculum that occurs on a cyclical basis. Big job, but I think the intent and spirit is okay. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, all. You all have had a lot of things put into your head, and now it's your opportunity to ask questions of any of us here.
My name is Vida O'Neill, and I'm from McKeesport. I very much appreciate a chance to come to this meeting tonight and listen to you people speak with the information you have to give us. I have the impression that the state is trying to address probably what everybody in this room is concerned about, that being the condition of the younger generation and what they can actually do when they get out of school. I think everybody in this room has heard the stories about Japanese companies coming to the United States and trying to hire high school kids and expecting them to do differential calculus, and they can't even get grad students that can do it. I would like to ask if the state, maybe Mr. White could answer this, does the state have a thought in mind of cutting down maybe the class size? Because if you're going to bury us in paper, you better get ready for a lot of burnouts.
I think we ought to direct that to Greg White. Have you been, are you aware of any talk in that direction?
There are no specific provisions linked to this proposal to change class sizes at all. Those determinations under this proposal would be made by the local school district. As the school board member mentioned here, that the state's not necessarily very good at following up requirements with additional dollars, and if we would do something like that, it would cost additional money. The state, at least under this present governor, is not prepared, I don't think, to provide those additional funds. So, no, there's no direct linkage. That would be a decision that would be made by the local school district in its collective bargaining negotiations with the teachers.
I just, thank you. I just wanted to go on record that there are a lot of teachers out there that really put a lot of heart and soul into their job, and they're worried about the kids. And they're worried about the spirit and the energy and the enthusiasm that goes into teaching. And I'm sure a lot of us are worried about the paperwork.
I think maybe, thank you for raising the issue. Perhaps when the local plans are made, that can be kept in mind, working towards that elimination of paper and bureaucracy, if you will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Glenn Dietrich. We live in Upper St. Clair, and we have two preschool children, so our children will probably go through this whole program. I've got about 3 questions. I'll try to make them short, and hopefully I won't have to get in line again. From what I'm hearing from the program, certain school districts and sections of states have tried similar programs already. This is something that is not completely new. Where did the idea come from? Montessori techniques, Europe, Japan? Do you have any idea?
Greg, are you in a
What kind of
position?
success has this program had globally? Is there any?
I'm going to let Greg handle that one again.
I'm not an educator by training. What I know about the origins of it, it seems to me that it is a combination of different things that educators have observed over a number of years. It combines some things that I have seen as part of educational theory, if you will, for a number of years, and it is based on the notion that students don't learn in isolation. That means they don't learn social studies just in a social studies class and in solely that context.
My next question, if I can go real quickly, we know that currently the educational system nationally graduates illiterates. What proposal, is there anything in this where it's kind of like you learn at your own rate? What will happen to those children who either mentally or socially cannot achieve what it takes to graduate into this program? What do you do with those children?
There are 2 things in it. There is a requirement for remedial assistance for those students. They would not be promoted through the school system on the basis of social promotions, which is what we basically do now. And it may get to the point that some of them actually don't graduate because of that.
Okay, is there remedial classes or whatever, but there is nothing new as
There's
far
no
as
specific
a
new
special
instruction
program
for
in this
remedial,
stuff?
no, it's that there's a directive that districts, and it'll have to be part of the strategic plan, and the district will have to document that they are indeed
Okay.
doing
Do I
it.
have a minute for one other quick question? It should be quick. It's a short question. How is this curriculum going to change a student's day in school if they're not going to be in little classes, subject classes? Maybe that was a big question. I don't know.
Kind of like to defer to the
I
professionals
wanted to
here.
say one thing to actually your first question. When our administrators went through the training here in the Pittsburgh area by Dr. Spady, he had a principal from a high school at Grosse Pointe South High School in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan, who has a conglomerate, a consortium of schools in that area, 20 or 30 schools that are truly leaders, from what I understand, in this outcome-based education program. You might want to contact them. I have the phone number up here because they said these people are very much believers. We asked that same very question, how does a typical day look in their program? And the way they described it, to be quite candid, it doesn't look much different than it would be at Boyce Middle School where I am, because we already do in our school district, I'm not sure what the others in the area do, we already had portfolio assessment. We've had it for a number of years. We already pre-test units of instruction and differentiate instruction for kids within that chronological age group. So the things the amenities that go along with this initiative, I don't feel very uncomfortable with because we already have embraced them just because I think they're good instructional techniques.
My name is Mary Campbell. I live in Upper St. Clair. I have a third grader, and I think I'm going to put him in private school. But I have 2 questions. One, if a parent elects that the child be excused from the instruction and from state assessments, what kind of educational training will my child receive if we stay?
I think you cannot have the child excused from instruction,
Well, that's what it says on that thing.
only from assessment.
It says instructional and assessment, yes.
Certain instructions. Certain instructions.
Yeah,
I think it's health and,
Oh, the aids.
No, it's a little broader than that.
thank you, Greg.
It is instruction, specific instruction which conflicts with religious beliefs. This is an expansion over what presently exists. Right now, that only applies to health and I think phys ed, kind of sex education programming. This is broader than it used to be, so that you cannot be excused from the entire curriculum unless you're going to try and make an argument that math and history instruction necessarily conflicts with your
Well, then
religious beliefs.
then I can have him excused from health and phys ed, and he will not be assessed for those 2 subjects.
He would not be assessed on the state test. What the district would probably be required, would end up doing is providing him with an alternative form of instruction that didn't, and the student would be assessed on that basis.
Okay, my second question is, how will the graduate's requirement affect a child that is college-bound? Will he have enough college credits to go on to another college if we're changing our requirements? Or what happens if we get transferred to another state? Will they recognize my child's training
I think
credits?
that's a very important question. And because of the option to eliminate the traditional grading system, and that's something that the locals are certainly going to have to take into consideration. But once again, Greg, and I don't mean to prevail upon you, but are you aware of discussions where they
Yeah.
address this issue?
Let me first address the first part of your question regarding the question about college admittance. Students from home education programs do not earn units of credits, and they are admitted to all different types of colleges all over the country. I think the colleges and universities will be prepared to deal with this. They are already in the midst of changing their admission standards and practices. So I think that they will evolve with this as this evolves. The second point is on going to another state. Yes, right now, another state knows that your child completed 3rd grade when you moved to Illinois. But the education system in Illinois is not necessarily compatible with the education system in Pennsylvania. The instructional levels at the 3rd grade in both states are not necessarily parallel. We don't have a national curriculum like we do in European schools. So what we find when students transfer here or students transfer other states is sometimes districts have to make qualitative judgments about a child, about where to place them. If this program is done correctly, there will probably be more detailed information in your student's record to take, I would at least hope so, for the district to evaluate where your child should be placed based on what your child has actually learned rather than sitting in a 3rd or 4th grade classroom for 3 or 4 years.
Good evening. My name is Vicki Swab. I'm in the Bethel Park School District, and I've been trying to sift through all of this for the last couple of months. Mrs. Langtree has been extremely helpful. I've been corresponding with the director of the State Board of Education, and I appreciate his keeping me abreast of what's going on. I'm still trying to make an opinion, and I do have a couple questions, one that the director was unable to answer and one that Mrs. Langtree did bring up. regarding one of the outcomes. Would you explain to me exactly what alternative interpretations of history is and why it doesn't say that facts about history will be taught? History occurred as a fact.
What I think-
It means politically correct thinking.
That's what I'm wondering.
Sorry, Greg. Let me have a little fun there.
And I do have two more questions, so if you could answer this, I would appreciate it.
I'm not going to tell you that it can't mean that.
You're kidding.
But to be very honest with you, a teacher can do that to a kid right now. And
Yeah, but it's
flunk
not
you
mandated.
Without having an outcomes-based education system.
Right, but I don't want
And most
it
kids have gone through that to some extent. What I think it is designed to mean is to address the question of, in history, there are different interpretations of how history evolved, be it an economic theory, be it based on geographic, the River Valley type of theory, social immigration patterns, and I think that is what that directive is aimed at. Now, does that mean that an individual teacher or school district couldn't say you have to accept the blank theory of history, economic determinism or something? It possibly could happen that way. But I think it is basically that you are supposed to look at various interpretations of history, how this country, other countries evolve.
Is that required now?
We don't
Is that
specify that at all. The determination of whether that is presented in a classroom is up to the classroom teacher.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
And whether the facts are taught or whether opinion is taught is also up to the classroom teacher.
Okay, I personally...
And the curriculum adopted by the board. Let me
Okay.
also say that.
I personally would like to see that wording changed. Okay, number two, the Pennsylvania Coalition for Academic Excellence has stated a few things opposite from what you have stated here, and I'm trying to find facts again. They've stated that this whole outcomes-based education will take away the control from the school district and give the state more control. Number one, how do you respond to that? And number two, this is a quote from the Education Reporter, the April issue, which states, a study made by the Wharton Business School shows that the startup cost for just 6 school districts would be $16 million. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's what this states. I'd like your response to that also.
Well,
And I
Greg,
thank
once
you.
again,
First, on the issue of state versus local control. We have not had any of the organizations which represent teachers, school administrators, or the School Boards Association tell us that they believe that this will enhance state control over local school districts. They have all endorsed it. They have all endorsed it with specific proviso that they believe that it gives them much more control. Secondly, I have not seen the Wharton School study. I'm not precisely sure what school districts they are referring to. I think I mentioned earlier that depending upon how a school district implements it, how much staff development work is necessary in a school district, that there can be costs. The question is whether a school district can offset those costs with the flexibility that they seem to believe is inherent in this program. If they can't, then it is going to cost more money.
Joe Bellina. I'm from Peters Township, and I have a question for Mr. White. You indicated that the effective approach is not new. It's been in place for almost 20 years, early 70s, and that coincides with an article that appeared both in the U.S. News and World Report in April and also in the Reader's Digest. And it indicated that effective has taken the focus away from our basics. And in the process, the bright kids of 1991 will be a generation that for the first time do not surpass their parents in achievement. Now, the question I have is, who is the dictator who has taken this failed system and jamming it down our throats and trying to take an education establishment which hasn't been able to teach the basics and saying, we're going to broaden the scope of what you have to do so that you do it better. I mean, that is mind-boggling to me. Who, when so many parents are against it, so many educators here have reservations about it, so many of our representatives have reservations about it, and yet we're told it's coming, there's nothing you can do about it. Is this...
I'd like to make one thing clear. Greg White's position is that he is very knowledgeable of education matters. He assists us enormously in the House. He does not work for, with, or against the State Board of Education or the department. He just happens to be a knowledgeable person. So,
then I'll draw on his knowledge.
But all that said, I'll bet you Greg can shed some light on it.
The proposal is drafted in response to, I think, the frustration which you have expressed, that the school system is not educating students to the level that they need to be educated to be competitive. I think there is a legitimate question about the focus of the particular goals and the learning outcomes. Those goals and learning outcomes were developed, to be candid, by the educational establishment. I'm not blaming any of these people up here for that, but they were. And they became the focal point again for this new approach to organizing curriculum. The professional educators liked what was developed in the 1970s, and they chose to stay with it. Whether the curriculum can be organized around specific enough academic objectives to achieve what I think you're aiming at, I think is a legitimate question. I would also say, and as I said earlier, we are getting comments from the business community that they want us to work with students on certain types of attitudes and values. I am not going to say, wait, please, let me finish. I said certain types of attitudes and values. The ability to work with other people, taking responsibility for what you do, promptness, quality. I'm not talking about things that necessarily conflict with your personal or religious viewpoints. But that's a very, very difficult thing for districts to do. But I will say this, that those kinds of activities which people object to go on now in classrooms all across the state without any specific outcomes based, and teachers do assess kids on those kinds of activities. Whether we like that or not, it does happen. That's probably not a satisfactory answer for you, but that's where the focus for this proposal, I think, came from.
And you asked, quote, who is, you said dictator.
Right.
I think you meant who's the person that's causing this in
Jamming this
Pennsylvania.
down our throat.
I can't answer that question, but let me read to you from yesterday's newspaper about what Governor William Weld is doing in Massachusetts. He is initiating the program. He is going to require, if he can get the legislation passed, every student to meet minimum proficiency standards in math, science, English, and social studies.
Wonderful.
Those are going to be their outcomes.
That's what education's
A
about.
solid core curriculum. Well, we have that, I think, here in Pennsylvania now. Not mandated by the state.
See, that's where education's supposed to be, and that was my first question, who that dictator was. And my second question was related, and that is, any other business where you tried something for 20 years and it failed, it would be tossed out and you go back to basics. I don't care whether you're a sports team, I don't care whether you're a business, it's on a slide, the president goes, a new president comes in, and we get back to basics.
My name is Sue Means. I've been homeschooling or home educating for 7 years. I have 5 children, and I know Greg White is a good guy, not a bad guy. I just want to go on record before I say what I'm going to have to say. I was thinking about sending my son to high school next year, but what I have to say is I'm really confused about a basic issue, and that is the TALS test and the EQA test were a violation of federal law.
Yes.
They were taken away from the public schools because there was attitudinal questions on those tests, and that made those tests psychological tests. And if you give a psychological test without written parental consent, that is in violation of the Hatch Amendment of federal law. And here we have this PSSA. And you're talking about, Greg, you were mentioning things like teaching kids to be prompt, working with other people. Those are things parents are supposed to teach. And those are attitudes. I'm really, really worried. How are you going to measure these things? And are you going to ask, I think that the PSSA is going to be a psychological test because it's going to measure attitudes. If it has one question, it makes it a psychological test. And so it looks to me like the state of Pennsylvania is asking every school district again to violate federal law and give these psychological tests. Why can't Bethel Park, Upper St. Clair, we all have solicitors, why can't we say, no, we're not going to do this. You can't make us violate federal. I mean, why I'm upset is everybody here is acting like we can't do anything. Let's just roll over and take it. And I don't think we should do something wrong. I don't think we can have the state make us do something wrong. So my question is, Greg, doesn't it look to you like this is again another, or Alice, whoever can answer it, isn't this again an attitudinal test, that they're a psychological test that the school districts are going to be mandated to give to children?
The federal laws and requirements she is referring to are contained in something known as the Hatch Amendment, which prohibits the use of psychological testing in curriculum in programs which receive federal money. The Department of Education does not use federal money to implement. Please let me state this. The state testing program, and therefore the Hatch Act amendment does not apply to this particular program. Now, let me finish answering your question. Secondly, as I mentioned previously, the tests that have been presently developed are in mathematics, they are in reading, and there is a writing assessment component. The EQA test, which she previously referred to, which did test attitudes and values, and which were the basis for a lady who is standing in line challenging the state's implementation of this program, resulted in a department directive which applied to programs which receive federal funds. And the reason I am convinced that that is the proper interpretation is that people who are very active in this Coalition for Academic Excellence asked us a number of years ago to enact a similar state law because federal law did not apply in that particular circumstance. The legislature didn't do it, but they did ask us as part of something that was commonly called the PAPA bill several years ago, which I worked very extensively on. The tests that were administered this year are academic. I have reviewed them. I looked at the questions, in particular in light of the concerns which you asked about. If any other tests are to be administered to students under these regulations, the Department of Education has to go back to the State Board of Education to get approval for state assessment on those other goals. Okay? That is a protection that we insisted be put in after we saw the first draft, and it was put in. I'm not sure if that provides you with sufficient protections, but we think some additional protections were inserted into the proposal to try and address those concerns. And for the State Board to do that, and the department to implement those tests and those other goals, it will have to go through the regulatory review process where the legislature gets another crack at saying, stop, we don't want it. We want to see what you're going to test. Okay? So I don't know if that's sufficient for you, but we did try and address those concerns.
And for the record, home-educated students do well in college, getting into college,
Yes,
because
they
they
do.
score in the 1200s and 1250s on their SATs, and not just because of portfolios.
Hi, my name
Okay.
is Mike Fisher. I live in Bethel Park.
Your name is Mike Fisher?
Mike Fisher.
Oh, you don't look like
right.
the Mike Fisher I know.
That's right. I got friends.
Yeah. And twins.
My question is, I have a couple of them here, but my first one is, on this strategic plan
Yes.
that these schools, all these areas are implementing, who is going to approve them? Now, I know the state is, but are we as parents going to have the privilege of seeing what they're going to do?
You, as parents, have the privilege to work with your school districts, boards, teachers, students, businessmen, community representatives to create the strategic plan. You'll have to be in touch with your school board people and tell them that you're interested in participating in creating the strategic plan. And when the plan is finally approved locally, then it goes to the state. And you've asked a very good question. Who finally approves it? A state group, I think it's the Secretary of Education, the Department of Education, and a group of teachers. And if they don't like it, it comes back to you for improvement, and you improve it, and it goes back, and the Secretary of Education has final say.
Why don't we go on for a couple of years then, actually just trying to get a strategic plan?
It could.
accommodate-
There's also a provision for a minority report on the strategic plan, and it was only the participation by the school boards was only more recently added to the regulations.
So then we will, as a parents in the community of our local school districts, will be notified that we can or cannot be.
I don't know that you'll be notified. You take the initiative.
I don't have a problem with that, but I have a problem with them shutting the door.
You call up your school board and you say, hello, I'm Mike Fisher, and be sure to say, but you're the real Mike Fisher, and tell them you want to participate in the development of the strategic plan. That's how I would do it if I wanted to participate.
That is the implementation that they're open to. And that is how it's structured.
There's no law saying how the people will be appointed to create the plan. It just says who has to participate.
Okay. Well, I just want
And it doesn't give any numbers of people, from each category, what students, teachers, parents, community.
Well, what about this? Well, okay.
Jump in there. Call them up and say, look, when you get ready, I want to be part of it. And keep hounding.
Well, if it'll produce. On this portfolio, is it an overall? Now, you said they're going to just base this on math, reading, and writing. But isn't the grad...
Portfolio is a locally assessed document. It's not...
Correct,
Okay,
I understand that, but that still means that my son or daughter will graduate from the local
Yes.
system, okay? And they're going to be based upon their portfolio, what they believe, what they think about things. their overall assessment of these criteria that you have here?
The assessment of the portfolio will really be determined by the school district.
That's what I'm saying.
And how they use it to comply with meeting the various outcomes. If they don't want to use it to comply with anything that's related to an affective outcome, if any remain when this is finally finished, they don't have to. If they want to do it strictly to evaluate a student's work in reading, mathematics, science, social studies, they can do it that way. The determination will be made locally.
Right, but I'm saying, but to graduate, you're going to have to accommodate the school district's portfolio requirements.
How they assess that, how they use it to assess your ability to meet the learning outcomes.
Well, isn't that a little unfair? Who's to say their school district, I mean, you know what I'm saying, that kid could be in school for 20 years.
That's
Seriously,
right.
been there 20 years going
That's
over and
right.
over. Tara, one moment, please, I'm talking.
The interesting thing
We don't
is-
have to educate students after 20.
I'm not trying to be funny or anything, but seriously.
No, after age 21, the schools are no longer responsible for educating an
Well, he
individual.
said 20.
So, 20 years. So in other words, my daughter or my child just have to wait it out till 21 and they'll graduate.
No, they will not. No, they will not. You may spend that much time in school and not graduate.
Well,
The basis of this is to say that if a student doesn't measure up, that student doesn't graduate. We're not going to give you a diploma for spending 12 years in school, whether you know anything or not. That's the difference.
okay. So then, like, my basic question, my question is, the school district is going to say what my child has to know or believe is culturally right.
Politically right.
Well, they are politically right in order to graduate. I'm saying that the school district is going to have that authority.
If they chose to do it, it's potentially possible it could happen.
Thank you, that's right.
Tony Catania, I'm a pastor from Bethel Park.
I'm
and
sorry, I didn't get you.
Tony Catania.
Hello, Tony.
Hi. It seems like 1963 they ran us out of schools. And now we've got an agenda here that's pure and simple secular humanism. No doubt about it. We've got behavior modification. We've got values clarification. Those are the issues. I'm not blaming you guys because I know I can hear your current of thought here. But I do want to know, regarding the information that I got from Alice, there was a 3-to-1 vote in the legislature to table this issue for further study, okay? And that vote was just ignored by somebody in the House that was able to set up a committee to do that. Is there anything we can do about that? Can we get this issue stopped right now since we have a 3-to-1 vote in the House? What can we do about it?
Well, I think what that 150 to 47 vote indicates is a great deal of sympathy and understanding that a lot of people don't understand this system yet. And that resolution was designed to delay the regulatory process until the legislature, we in the House, that is, had a chance to look at this and to figure out what it is. We passed the resolution, huge margin, to stop the regulatory process, and then for the House leadership to name a committee of 6 people in the House to look into this outcomes. The leadership, as I understand it, would not name the committee and consequently did not name the committee. And because they did not act timely, this was passed, I believe, in April, was it, or May? April. Because it was not handled timely, the regulatory process went on. And these things were all approved in the regulatory process, which is a State Board of Education, Independent Regulatory Review Commission, back to the State Board. So I'm not sure that the resolution is valid anymore. because the words are now outdated because the process has superseded it. The sentiment is still there by the legislators, I believe, to try and slow up the process.
So we need to contact,
The only thing that's left in the process for approval of these regulations, as I've said earlier, is the 52 outcomes. That's all that has not yet been approved in this process. The rest has. We can't delay the process for what's already been approved, and there's still time to work on the 52 outcomes because they're not going to be approved until
Okay.
September, and that's why we're here, to deal
Right.
with those outcomes.
may I ask you directly, what you're insinuating to me and all these people here is for us to raise an earthquake from the population to say, we don't want any outcomes. None. Zero. End the discussion.
May I add two things, Representative Langford?
Sure.
First, the ultimate implementation of these policies is contingent upon approval of the learning outcomes. If the learning outcomes are rejected by the legislature under the regulatory review process, the regulations will not take. Under the regulatory review process, we have a very complicated process which allows the legislature to comment and review on regulations. The initial comment and review comes from the respective standing committees. For education, it's the education committees. If it's something on welfare, it's the health and welfare committees in the House and the Senate. Those committees make comments to the respective agencies about changes that they want. Those were the changes that we talked about earlier that were made to these documents that came from the House Education Committee. If after a set of regulations are adopted and the legislature would like to say, we don't want them implemented, there is an additional procedure which allows a resolution to be passed by both the House and the Senate to disapprove them. It then goes to the governor, and the governor has to sign it just like he would a bill for it to become law. Now,
There's where we need to go.
let me put a couple of things in perspective for you, whatever your position is on this. First, it's important for you to understand that Governor Casey has endorsed these regulations.
Oh, he has.
Yes.
He's endorsed the regulations. He has not endorsed the outcomes.
No one has endorsed the learning outcomes yet.
Okay.
They're still under study. Okay. Now, as I said earlier, the learning outcomes are separate from the are considered separately from the final adoption of those regulations. They have to be adopted as final. The board's goal is to do that in September. Depending upon how much negative feedback they get, they may either have to delay that, or they may either 2 months or for a fairly significant period of time. But until they finally say we've adopted them, the whole regulatory process does not take effect. School districts are going into this planning cycle because the Department of Education and the board wanted those districts that are in the first year to be able to get started. It is important to remember that most of the districts are volunteers. They agreed to participate in this process because they wanted to. Okay?
Okay.
So I'm just putting this in a perspective
Right.
so you understand where we are and what's up.
My name is Ewing Brown. I live in Mount Lebanon. I'm also a Republican committeeman there. My children are all out of school. I have 2 grandchildren, and I'll make this short and sweet. I'm not going to ask any questions, but this is so vague, so full of politically correct education ease. I'll tell you what, you people, you younger people, I'm getting old at this game. You younger people are going to have to carry the ball on this one. But I'm telling you, this is garbage. And you better jump on it and do something about it. It's a good case of non-elected bureaucracy ramming stuff down your throats. Okay? That's all I have to say.
I take it you don't want any part of the system.
Hi, my name is
Hello.
Chris Walsh, and I live in Castle Shannon.
Yes.
Earlier, you referred to how you were going to take a sampling of the students to mark their academic progress. I'd like to know where you're going to get your sampling from. Who's going to determine which kids are tested?
The district will set that up with the Department of Education, as I understand it, depending upon how many kids the department needs to have tested and to get a representative sampling of the students within the school district. So that kids in every elementary school building in the district may not be tested. And the same questions are not given to each student in mathematics. They have a battery of questions they want to try and assess on mathematics skills. Due to sampling techniques that you can do, certain kids in school, in an X elementary school, will take certain tests that have X questions on it, and others will take tests that have Y questions on it. That's basically how it's going to be determined. I can't exactly sit down and break out the more detail.
Let me rephrase my question then. What is to stop teachers from picking their best students to take these tests to skew the results and make it look like they're doing a better job than they are?
I can just tell you what I think. I'm not sure that the test EQA or TELS are one of them. What we had to do, and I think this is an example of sampling, the strategy to get it sampling. They made us pass out an answer sheet to the students. They did not put their name on it. You did a third of the test today, and I think they passed back the answer sheets just randomly to kids because their names weren't on them. So you worked on a different answer sheet the second part, the second day, and the third. So you got an overview of, without children's names applied, of how the general population performed in the various subdivisions of the test. They'll probably do something like that again, I would think.
Yeah, the teacher in that classroom will not select the kids that are tested.
My other questions were already answered, so I'd like to make a few comments. First of all, I'd like to point out to Representative Langtree that although the State Board of Education does have the power to put out any kind of regulation they want, it is the State House of Representatives who allocates money to implement this garbage. And you can hit him in the pocketbook if you so desire.
Well, let me explain to you how I attempted to do that. In the Appropriations Committee, of which I am a member, when it came time, I put in an amendment to stop any expenditures by the Department of Education until the resolution that we had passed in the House was implemented. That amendment in the Appropriations Committee was voted down on a straight party line vote.
I don't need to ask
Can't do
which
any more
party.
than that. We tried.
And I'd also like to point out to everyone here, especially the Christian parents, that there has been a court decision declaring secular humanism to be a religion. Yeah. If they actually get this garbage through, I would encourage any and all Christian parents to go to court. If we can't have our religion in there, they're not going to put theirs in there either. Thank you very much.
I'm Frances Riley from Mount Lebanon. I see this as a dumbing down of our students, and I think parents must start collecting information and reading about all of these different programs, what's going on. This is the only answer. Now, the panel here told us that OBE was successful in Kentucky. I know, as a matter of fact, that it was a complete failure in Chicago, in Minneapolis, Minneapolis and in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. In Brownsville, Pennsylvania, they had billboards erected saying, "Get OBE mastery learning out of our school districts." And the parents and the teachers joined in this battle, and they were successful. They had it removed from the school. So where this has been used, it has been a complete and disastrous failure. And by the way, this all ties in with Bush's 2000 plan, so don't be fooled by that. My question, too, is why have we not discussed the collecting of personal data on these children, which is going to be disseminated to who knows where? I think people should be advised about this.
I think that, were you referring to collection of data for the state assessment, for the state test?
Yes.
You know that the state board removed any possibility for any individual student to be named or identified.
Well, I think there's some questions about that.
Well, okay, if there's another specific question on that, maybe Greg could handle that one. But that regulation has been passed, and in fairness, I don't think anyone said this has been successful in Kentucky, OBE. I think Greg mentioned that they were preparing to implement it in Kentucky. I have heard otherwise and elsewhere that this has indeed been a failure. In Chicago, and so on and so forth. If you have information, specific information on that, I'd appreciate receiving it.
Absolutely. One of the main concerns in Brownsville was that while they're going over all of this information with the slow student, your student who picks it up immediately sits there and twiddles their thumbs. This is not only the faster students, but those in the middle. So they're all geared to it's all geared to the student that is the slowest in the process.
How can that be when each student advances at their own level? How can the middle student be forced, or the faster student be forced?
Well, this is how it operates, and you will have to ask how it's implemented.
Yeah.
But this is how it operates, and this was their main concern and the concern of the teachers, because it's going to be very harmful for any of the student other than the ones that go at the slower pace. Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
My name is Anita Hogue. I'm from a neighboring school district, from the McGuffey School District. I am a national speaker on outcome-based education. I lecture all over the state. I'm executive member of the Pennsylvania Coalition for Academic Excellence. I am executive research analyst. I know a lot. I have a book out on the market. There are a lot of questions about outcome-based education and also a lot of misinformation. And I think it's very wise to have these informational meetings because parents have no idea what is going to happen to their children. And in the end, your children have to meet the graduation requirement. Your child has to meet the goal or they will not graduate, regardless of instructional time spent. Everything revolves around those exit outcomes. So what is most important is what does the child have to do in order to graduate? And this is what we must ask. How do you measure them? What is the standard? How do you score them? And what does my child have to do to be remediated to meet that standard? And unless that is very clear, these will be challenged, even if it means legally, by the Pennsylvania Coalition and hundreds of parents, because we will not let this happen. The first question I have, you had stated, Mr. White, that PSSA replaces TELS. That is a misstatement. The PSSA replaces EQA. TELS was never used for curriculum development. TELS was a competency test testing reading and math. EQA was used to target quality goals and the long-range plan. Most administrators know that. EQA was found to be in violation of federal law. I am also the parent that filed that federal complaint.
and one.
And federal funds were found.
As far as having a state system for assessing education, PSSA does indeed replace TELS.
Only in money.
TELS test was the only data which the state used to evaluate students and publish results about the educational performance of school districts on a statewide basis.
It evaluated individuals.
But it ended up you're right, that's what it was designed for, but it also ended up
PSSA is a matrix sampling technique that replaces TELS. That is a known fact. I really don't want to discuss that issue. That's not one of my main points.
What was your question?
One of the first amendments that have been issued, and I did speak on Monday in front of the State Board concerning the amendments and the student learning outcomes. The first says that the amendment will clarify the prohibition on releasing individual names, identifying numbers, or personally identifiable information from assessments to the state or the public. That did not say that they would not collect the identifiable information and give it to the National Center of Education Statistics, the NIE, research centers, the University of Pittsburgh Research and Development Center, or other areas. This prohibition should say no one shall receive any identifiable information. And this should be very clear because of the National Data Bank that we have access to and have information on. This data is leaving the state, and most people do not know very much about it.
Thank you for that specific. I really
It has to be
appreciate it.
specific that no one, and also, we also have the contract. Even though Secretary Carroll came out and stated that the children would not be identified because the name grid for computer coding and the student ID number would be removed. The contract states that the test is pre-coded to school, school district, teacher, and grade. So when they request a birth date, they know exactly who that child is. And we know that to be specifically. Also, in the contract, there are 5 generated data tapes. The only data tape that the school district gets is the school aggregate. What happened to the individual by subject area, the individual by demographics, and all the other generated data tapes. Do you know, Mr. White? I'd requested that information. Most people do not know, nor do they understand where the data is going. Another amendment says they will extend to parents the right to have their children exempted from state assessments and from specific instruction which conflicts with their religious beliefs. We've already talked about the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. You also have to realize that EQA, which was mandated for long-range plans prior to these new regulations, already have programs that have implemented different objectives already in the Common Core goals. And you find them integrated throughout all of the quality goals and throughout all curriculum. So you may have self-esteem in a health program, you may have self-esteem in a drug program. So when you look at the other outcomes, even though it has stated that the Common Core would not be tested, for instance, in personal, family, and community living, it says in an outcome being judged right now, they will measure to develop interpersonal decision-making, coping, evaluation skills, and apply them to personal, family, and community living. How is that going to be measured? Okay, in another one under citizenship, they are going to, I'm going to go to appreciating and understanding others. Recognize intrinsic uniqueness, work, and rights. How are they going to measure the intrinsic uniqueness of my child without psychologically testing and forming a profile? Once you decide that you are going to test areas which are very subjective, and by the way, they are measurable. I have all the evaluations of EQA. They measured adaptability to change by testing at what point the child will change without protest. Most of of your school directors or even your school administrators have no idea what the state is doing with the data. All you know is that they give it and it goes away.
Anita, have you a specific question at this point?
Well,
I appreciate all the information.
I think it's very important to understand that parents need to be empowered to know that these are their children. These are your children. You own your children. The state does not own your children. And you must be empowered to understand that there are several things that we can do. Number one, refuse to have your children tested. Do not give them the data to work with. Do not let them have access where the data will be transferred into a national data bank. This is the premise for America 2000. We are on the brink of America 2000. I have documentation for 35 other states, and guess what's there? All the states have EQA. They have strategic plans. They have the same goals. They have the same objectives. Don't let it happen. I would like to know what the state board will do, even if parents go to these hearings. If this is mandated by the federal government and a national data bank that codes loyalty, faith, everything, all the little tiny codes, can cross-reference this information, and this is being mandated on the federal level, what can an individual parent do when they go in front of the state board and say, we don't want this?
Are you suggesting the outcomes are mandated at the federal level?
These are national.
Or the goals, for example?
Pennsylvania was a pilot for the national goals. The EQA is a pilot for the nation. They are bringing
We are a pilot. Are we a designated pilot? By
in
whom?
the affective domain.
By whom at the national level?
There was a president's committee that was formed way back under President Kennedy, but it was brought through President Johnson. All of these people came to Pennsylvania and formed the EQA. The historical background we have. What we are saying is that we are a pilot for nationally validated program, national testing in the affective domain, national standards, and it's Pennsylvania that is pushing it forward. But I've been in Iowa. I have the documentation from Maryland, Maryland, from Arkansas, from Oklahoma, from Michigan. They're all the same. This is a program that's being forced down your throats to implement America 2000 for the New World Order. To have specific attitudes and values that you will accept a new world order.
Anita, who is behind this? Who is the group or the organization or the individual that is